Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to all of the PhD students who are part of the University of Texas PhD Symposium. You've signed up for an excellent second day, the second annual of the symposia organized by the Salem Center for Policy at UT Austin. And I'm Andrew Karolyi. I'm a professor of finance here at Cornell, and I'm going to be the moderator for what I understand is an eagerly anticipated editors panel, something that will give you, as rising scholars, a lot of insights, a leg up as you launch your careers. Joining me today are three exceptional scholars who serve in key editorial roles. Laura Veldkamp of Columbia Business School. She just completed a 3-year term as the co-editor of JET, the Journal of Economic Theory, and is now an editorial board member at AEJ Micro and Econometrica. Amit Seru of the Stanford Business School, who is the co-editor of the Journal of Finance, and Mark Lang of UNC's Keenan Flagler School, who is a co-editor at the Journal of Accounting and Economics. And while I am a college dean right now, I did serve for 8 years as the editor of the Review of Financial Studies. So thank you, Laura, Mark, Amit, for joining the panel. I think we're going to have a lot of fun this morning. So the program is 75 minutes long. I'm speaking to our PhD students out there. What we're going to do is have a conversation among the four of us for about the first 30 to 45 minutes. Basically, it's going to be about the business of publishing, what motivates scholars, referees, editors, publishers, journal associations, what are the trends, developments in the business. But I want you to know that in all of this discussion, what we're focused on is basically why and how does all of this translate into best practices for you as an emerging scholar seeking to publish successfully in these journals. I suspect that the conversation is going to touch on a bunch of issues that are on your minds. In fact, I'm confident it will, but I'm also 100% certain it will not address every single one of the questions that are on your mind. So here's the deal, and I'll repeat this a few times. For the last half hour or so of our session, we're going to focus on your questions. And your job is going to be to start to formulate those questions as you hear the conversation and place them in the chat. And I will be looking to choose from among them and pose them on your behalf to the panel. So you ready to go? Everybody ready to go? I think so, right? So let me start with each of our editors. I'm going to ask them to briefly talk about the specific missions of the journals that they serve. So for you PhD students out there, you may be surprised to hear that as an opening question, but it turns out each editor of every journal who signs up to serve, and just to remind you, essentially as volunteers on behalf of their fellow scholars, they accept an affirmative obligation to advance the mission of the journal. And guess what? It's more than just, please publish good papers. So why don't we start with, let's start with you, Laura. What's the mission of the journal? You can choose which one you'd like to talk about. You're now serving 3 or have served 3. And how do you, and mostly how you think about that?
So, I mean, I guess I was engaged most intensively with the Journal of Economic Theory as an editor. I was handling about 200 papers a year. That's useful to keep in mind when you submit things, that there's a lot of volume going on and you want to behave accordingly. But for JET, that's really a journal that's there to support theory and empirical work that's grounded in theory. And that makes it pretty different from, it gives it a distinct identity relative to the other journals we're going to be talking about today. And, there's always a question, where do you draw the line, I guess, of what fits in a journal, whatever that journal's mission may be, whether is this finance or not finance, is this theory or not theory? And every editor draws that line a little differently. So, I might have had much more tolerance for quantitative work, for example, than some of the editors who are micro theorists and really never come close to numbers. And so I felt like if it informed a theorist, I think about who is it that's likely to read this journal and what are they interested in. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the same as what they do, but it would be of interest to them. So it might be empirical work that informs the way we should write down models. I would find that okay, right? Now, reduced form regressions that have no relationship to models, that's probably, that is clearly outside the purview of that journal. But that's how I thought about drawing that line.
Fantastic. Amit, you go next. The mission of the Journal of Finance.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so, the Journal of Finance, the mission is very straightforward. It publishes leading research across all major fields in financial research. What makes it tricky is that if you look at, especially after the financial crisis of 2007, finance became front and center to many of the things that were happening in the economy. And as a result, economics and finance, which were always intertwined, became even more intertwined. So you see lots of papers which touch on macroeconomics and finance now becoming more prominent in finance journals, including the Journal of Finance. And that's driven by what's been happening around us. By the way, this, the mission statement, like you emphasized, is something that many times we don't pay attention to. And before Journal of Finance, I spent about 2 years as a department editor for finance in management science. And there, again, you're publishing papers in finance, but the mission statement there is you're publishing research on the theory and practice of management. So the focus there is papers which are finance, but could easily be touching on accounting and strategy and innovation and other things where you have to be a bit more flexible because that's what management science is and that's what their readership is. Whereas in the finance space, I think it's anything in financial economics. And my experience in the last 5 years and even before that, serving as associate editor, was that papers are becoming more and more in the space between economics and finance, way more than before, because of what has happened around us in the last decade and a half.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's really helpful. Actually, the contrasting perspective with your experience at Management Science and Journal of Finance means you had to think about that pivot. Yeah, great. Mark, JAE.
I should caveat by saying that this is my second year as editor at JAE, although I was a guest editor at JAR before, so I'm still sort of getting the ropes. I was a little horrified. I was thinking I have edited probably 300 papers. And then a couple of days ago, Andrew was saying that he saw 7,782 papers, if I remember correctly, at RFS. So I think on a good night with a glass of wine, he probably handled 300 papers. But yeah, so this is sort of my impressions from being at this for about a year and a half. The Journal of Accounting and Economics, as the name suggests, is interested in sort of the intersection between accounting and economics. And it was founded to bring sort of economic insights into thinking about accounting kinds of questions. And so when we think about accounting, we think about it pretty broadly in terms of almost anything that involves information flows, but especially information flows that interact importantly in some way with accounting systems. So from the journal's perspective, most of what we see is sort of financial reporting kinds of papers that have to do with communication with investors. But then also we see tax fits in there, managerial information systems in firms. There's some auditing. Most of what we see is going to be capital markets empirical, just because that's mostly what we get on the submission side. And then there's a good representation of analytical modeling and a little bit of experiments and things like that coming sort of on the new end of stuff coming in.
Yeah, so there's some breadth of methodology that you're emphasizing as well. Like Laura was talking about the balance of theory and empirics there as well. And Amit didn't talk about methodology or anything, which means it's all encapsulating. By the way, Mark's teasing me back about the volume. It tells you a little bit for the PhD students out there about how different journals are differently structured as well, right? So when I was making that claim as the executive editor, every submission comes to an editor-in-chief or an executive editor, and then of course they have teams of co-editors to which these papers are then distributed. So I was counting those too, Mark. I didn't write 7,800 decision letters, but certainly the papers went through my hands. So one of the important things, that was a great start. So one of the important things that PhD students transitioning to rising scholars reflect on is basically how to design a research project that is publishable and impactful. And so the logical question, I know this is a logical question that you get and have heard, and that is on every single one of these PhD students' minds, is what exactly are the journal editors looking for? And I guess the way you might think about answering this is in terms of your incentives and as editors, more than just your affirmative obligation to advance the mission of the journals that you serve, but your incentives as editors to maybe be looking for some kinds of project ideas over others. And I guess, you know, indirectly, I'd like to know whether you think about the associations that oversee journals as influencing somehow the way you think. Some journals are affiliated with associations, some are more independent. And does that factor in when you are in that sort of situation? So shall we go to Laura again to start out? What are you looking for is the big overarching question.
I think there are three sorts of considerations. You know, one is, are there areas that, you know, we as an editorial team, me and my co-editors, would really like to see advanced? You know, Jet would love to publish papers that, you know, help address climate change in a meaningful way. There are not a ton of theory papers that do that, but you know, if you have something, we're really going to work with you because that's something that we all felt passionately about, or new emerging areas that we think are exciting, and this might be growing that area. So there are a few strategic areas that, you know, we'd like to see, but most papers won't fit in that. I think the second consideration is all journals are being evaluated by impact, right? So we'd like to publish papers that are going to be really highly cited. You know, especially for theory papers, that's a challenge. Theory papers systematically tend to be less cited, you know, than empirical papers. So we were particularly, you know, wrestling with that limit, let me say. But it's very hard to gauge. And then I think that, you know, the third thing, so what that means for you as a writer is you want to be very clear about who would use this or who would cite this and for what purpose, right? A research project should serve a purpose. It should be useful to somebody. And you may know why it's useful, but don't leave it to your editor to guess why it's useful. You want to write that out explicitly, right? I think the third thing you want to think about is that, you know, I don't want to say I need positive referees because, you know, I have overruled negative referees when I thought they were too harsh and I thought this was a great project. And I think good editors should exert their editorial independence and oversight and do that. But if it's not in my direct area of expertise, at some level, I need somebody to help me get this paper over the bar. And if I can't get people who are positive enough to be willing to really engage with the paper, and I don't know enough about this particular sub area to, you know, to say myself, here are the things that need to happen. I know what's going to make this a quality paper. It becomes really difficult for me to publish it, even if I do like it. So you got to target the paper, help me find somebody who can help you, you know, publish this by you know, signaling who's the audience that this is intended for, and think about for that audience, what would make them like this paper? What would make them find this useful? Who are you writing for, and what should they get out of this, right? So really think about your paper as having a value proposition to a particular group of people. And if you can, you know, if you can do that and signal those people and convince them that there's some value in their paper, there's something that, you know, they've learned from it, or some tools that they could use, or some ideas that are complementary to what they're doing, or something like that, they're likely to be positive. And being positive means they're going to make constructive suggestions about how to make the paper better. And that's going to make it possible for me to publish that paper.
Yeah, I hear a lot in there, actually, Laura, but I really like that you're reinforcing to the PhD students the importance of crafting carefully the way they describe the contribution of the paper, spending time there and not just sort of spraying a list of other papers that it might be related to, but really thinking carefully about what is the incremental value add. That's great. That's great. Amit, what are you looking for? What are editors looking for?
Yeah, it's hard to top what Laura laid out, because I think that's pretty much exactly what at least I have been doing since I have been doing editorial job. I think for me, the main focus is always that, is this an area, or is this a topic, or is this a paper where I think other subsequent research are going to build on, which is the same as saying that, is this paper going to be cited by others who are going to build on this? And that's always a judgment call, as you can imagine. So having one reason why you have an editorial board where you have a bunch of editors is that hopefully when we aggregate across different editors and their taste functions and preferences, you're going to get a collective set of folks who can project in the future that these are areas where, yeah, there's going to be a lot of research, like Laura said, climate. A decade and a half ago, household finance was similar. You know, John Campbell, 2005, gave a presidential address saying household finance, and then, you know, it was meandering somewhere, and then it took the financial crisis for it to take off. But at that time, when editors were taking bets on this area, they were taking bets because they were saying, okay, this is a paper. I think this area can evolve. This paper is very clear what the contribution is, and others can hopefully build on this. And that's always a challenge. And, you know, when the field is very mature, for example, think about corporate governance coming from a finance perspective. Corporate governance has been around now for two decade and a half. For a paper now to say clearly that this is my marginal contribution and that this is something that's really important. Remember that the journals that we are talking about here publish 6-7%, 8% of papers every year that they get. So we are rejecting more than we are accepting. So you have to make a call that, is this paper in an area like corporate governance going to push the boundary beyond what we already know? And that's always hard. Marginal contribution is something that is always front and center. It's another way of saying that, is there going to be impact? You're trying to maintain and improve the journal's ranking. Like I mentioned before, I think because finance is now at the cusp of more of what is happening in economics. That's why when every year, so Journal of Finance is affiliated with the American Finance Association. So when we have our meetings and the executive editor, in our case, Stefan Nagel, presents the report, there is always comparisons, like Laura was saying, hey, here is how Journal of Finance compares with the other finance journals and the econ journals. So you're always evaluating, okay, and the reason to compare it with econ journals is because we are playing in that space way more than before, I would argue. And as a result, your comparison is always, you know, you're looking at a QJE, which has a tremendous impact in our profession. And you may or may not like what kind of papers they publish in your journal, but you're at least trying to say that, okay, there is impact like that, and we are hoping to get that. And that's what we are looking for. It's not an easy job, but we all try our best.
You know, what I really like, and you're reinforcing an important point that Laura is making, which is that there is some, you know, as editors, that you have your antenna out and you are eager to look for those emerging topics that are clearly important but underserved. That's you're geared to that, and you're just eager to try and support that and find ways. That was the sort of message about having referees to help you get it over the top too, right? Is looking for those emerging topics. So Mark, how do you think about this? You know, what are we telling people about what editors are looking for as far as research, kinds of research?
So it's hard to say much more than has already been said. I mean, I think referring to citations seems a little bit cynical, but I think it is kind of a nice summary statistic for whether the paper, you know, is interesting to people and whether it especially leads to follow-on innovation. So I completely agree. You're looking for something that's new and that's going to be built on and is going to be lead somewhere. And one of the other editors said to me once, when you see a paper that appears in a competitor journal and you think, geez, why didn't we get that paper, right? That's especially, they said it's even worse if you rejected a paper and then it shows up in another journal and is super highly cited. So yeah, you're trying to sort of anticipate where things are going. For us too, I think because we're a bit more of an applied journal, it is important, especially I think, to be able to show that someone is going to care about it. And hopefully that someone is other than another academic, right? So it's one thing to get a lot of citations, but you should be able to say, here's how someone in the real world might actually use this to make a decision.
Yeah. I actually love another part of your message there is the intensely competitive nature of this business among the journals. We're all part of the same scholarly association, of course, but when we're committing to serve one of the journals, we want to advance that journal maximally successfully. So we're looking for those papers. What are they? They have like red hot chili peppers in the Web of Science if they're designated highly cited. I don't know what internal metrics Web of Science does, but you want to be the journal with more red hot chili peppers on the Web of Science. Good for you. Great answers. Okay, so for the PhD students out there, many of you were probably listening to that special session that Sheridan Tippman hosted yesterday morning with the IMF's Tobias Adrian, Jim Paterba, and Jeremy Stein. They were talking about this research imperative on public policy issues, and they were talking about, I think, bank regulation, corporate taxation. They got into mandatory disclosures on climate risks, just like Laura Starks' session late yesterday. Organizations like the Responsible Research in Business and Management, RRBM network, I'm on the board, I'm disclosing, they're advocating for the production of knowledge that can be used to inform progressive government policy, and also to promote best practices in business. So got to ask, how do you, in reference to what we were just talking about in terms of what you're looking for, how do you as journal editors think about the importance of policy motivation or for motivation that links to issues of relevance to CFOs, CIOs, auditors for the papers that you get to evaluate? Why don't we flip it here? Let Mark go first. To be fair, I don't want to be accused of always giving teeing up Laura to give the best first answer. Mark.
So yeah, the JE is very policy oriented, right? So I think for us, having a paper that is clearly designed to help with policy is a pretty important part of our mandate. And I was actually, I'm going to shout out here to Scott, who has an excellent podcast called Policy in Pieces. And if you haven't listened to it, it's really good. But one of the early ones I listened to there is he was saying that in his experience at the SEC, he was surprised at the extent to which the research they tended to go to came out of the accounting journals primarily, right? Which made me feel good because that's exactly kind of what we're shooting for, right? Is coming up with stuff that would be relevant to policymakers and or bank regulators or whomever. So yeah, for us, I would say it's clearly just front and center in what we hope to do.
But not every paper has to have
not
a
every,
policy
no, not
angle.
every,
but there is a, yeah.
There's a distinct taste, yeah.
Amit, taste for policy or hesitation, pushback, or relevant?
Yeah, I think the Journal of Finance, at least even before I got on the editorial team, I mean, if you look at Ken Singleton and that editorial team, they were publishing enough papers which had policy bent to it. Part of it is, again, I think related to what we saw in the world economy after the Great Recession. And there was a great desire to have academic research which would inform policy. In some sense, when the Great Recession happened, as happens in all crises, the policy was ahead of whatever academics might be telling you. And so there was always a catch up in academic space of saying that, okay, was this policy reasonable or what could have been done better? So there have been a lot of lots of work in that sort of genre, and that's something that Journal of Finance and I think all finance journals have latched on to pretty heavily. Banking used to be banking theory, and now if you see, it's mainly banking empirical work. Banking, I don't know, this used to be a joke when we were PhD students back in the day, that if you are running, if you're doing empirical work, you throw out utilities and you throw out banking, and then you look at everything else. And then when the crisis happened, when people asked, hey, well, why is this happening in banks? And we were like, oh yeah, that data we threw out. You sort of learn from each crisis, and policy relevance, I think, is now front and center in, I think, all finance journals, is my experience. In fact, economics journals too, as Laura would tell. I mean, if you see the proliferation of economics journals and how many financial economists have published in the last 2 decades, I would say, or decade and a half really, is way more than before. Partly again, because economics field itself also was craving for, okay, there was a big crisis and it was in the financial sector, and we didn't think that sector could do anything, and now it's doing a lot. So what did we miss? And I think so every journal pivots, and policy is front and center. Is everything supposed to be policy? No. But if there is policy relevance to what you do, that's always a good thing. So it's always a good, as a PhD student, if you're working on something, to clearly articulate what the policy relevance is. And same way, like you're thinking about other academics building on your work, it's always good if there's some policy relevance and policymakers actually might use it as well. That's a plus.
Yeah. So what I unpack in what you just said is there may actually have been a pivot somewhere along the line in the finance journals towards being more receptive to policy related work. Laura, one of the questions in the chat that just popped forward is exactly on this topic. So the timing was perfect, from Francisco Miguel. And I think he's asking whether it's in the context of JET, which you were managing before. Could you imagine a paper with a policy angle in the framing of a journal like JET? But you could also answer it for Econometrica and AJ Micro.
Or JME, which I've been involved
with. Yeah, JME. You're also on the JME board.
Broad spectrum of econ journals. Okay, so absolutely, you can publish you can publish a policy relevant piece in an econ journal. As Amit pointed out, that's becoming more common. However, I would also say that economics is a less applied area on average, right? There are different subfields with different tastes, but then finance or accounting. That those tend to be fields that are more oriented towards practitioners. And so you'll have, it's much more acceptable in an economics journal to say, I'm just going to lay out how we should think about this problem. And then somebody else can take that and use it to say what the policy ought to be. But that's not the goal of this paper. That doesn't mean that's the only thing. Again, you can send, policy relevant pieces to JET or to any other journal, to JET, as long as they're theory relevant, right? Linear regressions that inform policy are probably not going to be a good fit for JET, but they might be, they might be great for AJ Micro. So, there's the journal and its style, but I would emphasize that I think the difference with econ journals is that they're more open to writing pieces that will inform other more applied economists, right? It would be perfectly fine to publish something in Econometrica that we think would guide how, finance faculty or accounting faculty write papers that then are, more policy relevant. So it's foundational work is much more common and more accepted.
That's fascinating. Actually, to think about an editor at one of these econ journals thinking about that, the fact that they know that there are these externalities and influences of their work to other disciplines like accounting and finance and maybe others, that's inside your heads. That's fascinating. Fascinating. This is my chance to remind the PhD students, if they have questions to come forward, please start sending them into the chat or to the Q&A, so we can meet them. So here's another one that I know comes up. So as important as it is to design and launch a research project, it may be just as important to figure out whether and when to abandon a project. And I suppose the reason I'm asking three editors is because some important trigger for deciding whether a project is going to fly or not may come from, let's say, not just one, two, maybe a series of rejections that has occurred for a particular paper. So I'm asking you to take your editor hat off a little bit, and now as senior scholars, advising young people on moving their projects forward. So when do you terminate a project? What's the thinking here? Let's go with Amit for the kickoff here.
Oh, I was hoping that I'll always be in the middle, so perfect. But I guess my time ran out. Yeah, so I think as authors, when all of us were PhD students at some point and faced this, so I think this is a good topic to discuss. All of us, when we are working on projects, we think that's the best project ever. That's why we are all passionately working on it. And then you discuss it with your colleagues, you try to present it in conferences, submit it there. Hopefully you get into conferences. And then once you get feedback and you think you have incorporated enough, you send it to a journal. And if the news is not good, you take the feedback and reflect back on it and try to understand what went wrong. Many of the times, like what Laura said, it's about communication. It's about not emphasizing the things that were probably there, but you didn't anticipate. These are the things that folks are getting more excited about than others. You are excited about something, the profession is excited about something else. So you try to figure out, is there a balance that you can strike? And you take that feedback, send it again. And if the news is again negative, you again try to do that. But there is a limit to how many times you can keep doing this, because if the feedback is consistently negative, you have to update as rational players. And the reason to do it is because our times are limited. Our times are limited. And if you don't do it, you are just, following the sunk cost fallacy pretty much, right? You're putting in more and more effort in something that may not yield a good outcome. And it happens with everyone. You have projects where you thought great things about it, and your co-authors did too, and you keep submitting and you keep getting bad draws, and you update at some point and say, okay, maybe I was wrong or we were wrong, and this is not something that's flying, and then you move on. But everybody has to sort of do that, because otherwise you're not going to think about new ideas. You're going to be demotivated, because getting rejected is demotivating. I think all of us, like I said, think that the ideas we are working on and are passionate about are the things where we are putting our blood and sweat. So when you get rejected, you're like, yeah, this is not good. But getting rejected again and again and again is very demotivating. And you as scholars, especially in your PhD time, and when you were early scholars in the profession, you want to hear positive news. Positive news in our profession is happens in at very low frequency. So you got to figure out how to keep yourself motivated. And if that low frequency is only negative news, that's happening anyway. So you want to try and minimize that. It's easier said than done. I'll say that, because all of us, I'm sure, have had projects where we felt exposed that we probably kept going with it way too long. We shouldn't have. But that's what maturity is. And that's a skill that you learn as researchers, that when do you say, okay, this is not going anywhere. I mean, another skill as researchers you're trying to get at is that hopefully you are going to have very few of these projects where you start something, put a lot of blood and sweat, and then you see a lot of rejection. That's the skill you're developing. But in the beginning, it's all about internalizing that feedback so that you get there. If you don't internalize that, you'll never get there. That's the way, at least I think about it. So
that's great. Laura, add anything?
I think you want to think hard about trying to figure out why you're getting rejected. So, there are a lot of different possibilities. One is that your paper is going to the wrong audience. right? That there's a group of people who's really excited about what you're doing, but you're not getting those people as referees, in which case you really want to think about crafting, recrafting your paper, maybe retitling your paper. One of my favorite papers that ended up being successful got rejected many times because the title suggested it should go to a community of people that was not the community of people who was going to appreciate a theory paper, right? And so I needed to retitle the paper to get it directed to the right folks. That's sometimes rejections mean you're ruffling some feathers of people who are doing things one way and you want to do it another way. That's really tough. Those are the ones I try to look for as an editor, where, if somebody's that upset over a paper that they're really certain this should be rejected, I almost think there must be something in there that, that was that was meaningful, that engaged this person. I'm like, maybe I want another opinion on this one. So, is that what's happening? Or a lot of rejections are, you did something, even if you did this perfectly, I don't think this is a big enough contribution, right? And that's a very different sort of rejection. And there, do you abandon it? Well, you could take it down a notch. There are a lot of journals beyond the, top 3 in finance or, accounting or whatever. And you'll probably find a home for it. You probably don't want to keep putting a lot of energy into revising it, depending on what the tenure standards are at your institution, how much this may help you or not. But you might be able to find a quick and easy home, at a different journal. I don't usually think about abandoning projects as much as I do putting them aside and letting them ferment for a while. So sometimes I had projects that just seemed utterly unsuccessful before we ever submitted them. Just, it doesn't make sense. It's just not right. You put them aside. And even sometimes a couple of years later, oh, wait a minute, this paper shouldn't be about A causes B. This paper should be about B causes A. That's way more interesting. There's an audience for that. That's much more logical. And you just, you find a different way of thinking about it. So sometimes you need to say, okay, this isn't working. I'm not sure why this isn't working. Let me put this on the back burner for a little bit. And maybe I can, over time, think of a better way to put this project together.
That last point builds on Amit's, which is about the opportunity cost of your time. It's so valuable, right? So maybe putting something aside to ferment, that's visual, is really important to give you the opportunity to work on something that is more acutely timely. I like that. Mark, anything to add on abandoning?
I would just make a couple points. I think, first of all, referees can be idiosyncratic, right? So I think there's a temptation when you're starting out to take your first referee report, especially if it's negative, as the gospel, right? So, it's worth going back to the well again. The important thing, the only way you get published is by submitting things, right? So it's important to be willing to go back into the game again and not be too disappointed. Now, obviously, if it happens again and again, that's a different message. And then I would say it's often helpful to bring in a new set of eyes, even as a potential co-author, and just say, would you have any interest at all in participating in this? And sometimes the person's going to say, no thanks, right? Which is probably a message to you that you can't convince, even though you've done a lot of the work, somebody else to join in. The last thing I would say is, I think some of it is personal psychology. And so some people really like closure. And so I think it's worth it for them to sort of go down a tier and find a home for it and feel like, it was put to one side. And other people are sort of better dealing with it as kind of sitting there as something that might be of interest later on. But a lot of, especially when you're starting off, is the psychology of kind of keeping motivated and understanding what works for you in terms of, keeping the wheels turning.
I just want to build on that, which is
please go ahead.
The single biggest mistake I see my junior colleagues making that sidelines them for tenure is getting freaked out by their first rejection and then sitting on the paper forever. And you're like, look, somebody didn't like what you did. Try again. Maybe rearrange your introduction a little bit, but get it back out there. You can't get tenure if you don't submit your papers. So, I fully agree with Mark. Don't give up too quickly. It's another thing if you're getting rejected time after time after time after time again. But your first rejection, you probably should just chalk it up to, you got a little unlucky with the draw. Think about things you can do quickly to fix it up. But for God's sake, don't sit on papers just after, you know, one rejection. Think about things you can do quickly and get back in the game.
I like that message too. One of my distinguished advisors from grad school 30 years ago, who will remain unnamed, said that we write to be read. We write to be read. If you don't publish it, it can be read, but it will be amplified if you get it published. And if you think about your research, not as a paper, but as a program of research with a series of papers where the ideas build, then getting it published allows for the next idea to come forward and to build and to expand the research program. So, yeah. We are now getting questions, but I thought, well, you know, many of them are process oriented. And so, you know, you have lots of great ideas here that you're sharing. Let's call this our short snappers section. So what I'll do is I'll just throw these questions out, and one of you sort of put up your hand and say, yeah, I'll take that one. And then if another one wants to really add something to it, then we'll go there. But we'll do a bunch of these sort of short snapper type of questions that are mostly about process that I know are on lots of people's minds. So here's some, okay? So do you as editors have thoughts on what might be the right time to submit a paper to your journal? The amount of time. Is there such a thing as too fast, too soon, too late, optimal? Okay, Mark. Okay, go, Amit. Yeah, go.
So I think what you want to avoid is sending in papers either too early or too late. And too early is the thing that happens in all the journals. I'm sure that Mark and Laura have enough instances where you see a paper and it's not, you can tell that it's not polished in the way it's written. The contribution is not clear. It's not clear. You know, there is, if it's a theory paper, there is theory, there is proofs and stuff, but you know, it's not written in the best possible way. The connections are not there. If it's empirical work, similarly, you're probably not chalked out clearly what the contribution is. You've cited a few papers, but it's the, you know, it's like, okay, this paper is related to everything. And that you want to avoid, because in most journals, you know, the pool of referees that you can go to is limited. I mean, everybody is doing a service to the profession, and everybody wants their paper to be dealt in the best possible way, which is understandable. But the pool of referees is pretty limited. So as an editor, you're trying to balance that. And if you tax whatever pool of referees you have again and again on papers that are undercooked, then you are, you know, you can't go back to the referee again if you use them for an undercooked paper, for a paper where their input would have been very valuable, because you're looking for them to guide the papers that deserve a chance. And as an editor, you're trying to balance that. So, right, you know, desk rejections happen. I see a question in the chat as well, which I think is relevant to be answered here. When editors desk reject, that's what they are trying to balance. That, do I send it to a referee, or I can look at it and I can see that this is going to be rejected with a very high chance. And, you know, for an author, it's not a great feeling. I mean, I remember as a PhD student having submitted to QJE, and I think in 15 minutes later, I had a letter from an editor who will remain unnamed, pretty well typed letter saying sorry, you know, and you look at it and you're like, why is this happening? How can anybody reject my paper in 15 minutes? You can, because as an editor, you sort of are used to understanding what kind of papers do you accept as a journal? What's my mission statement? And the paper doesn't fit. It's not a statement about the editor having checked all the tables and theorems and proofs. It's about, okay, is this paper going to fly with the reviewing process? And yeah, you want to avoid that because even though it's idiosyncratic, again, like Mark said, but still idiosyncratic that happens in 15 minutes is probably not a good idea. You don't want to keep sitting on it for too long, like Laura said. where because you can go to your colleagues, you can go to their colleagues, you can go to other people in the profession, you can keep presenting in conferences. One thing that's great about our profession is that you will always find comments. Any paper you present, however polished it is, people will have some comments. And if the contribution you think is big enough, and the comments that you're now getting are extensions or robustness of tests, those are things that you can try during the reviewing process. And then let the referees tell you what are they excited about, so that you can extend it in certain ways.
Yeah.
So I think early, for me, you shouldn't submit too early. And like Laura said, that you want to get tenure, you want to proceed in the profession, so you do want to get published. So you probably don't want to submit papers 4 years after you have the first draft. But I think within a year of the first draft, through all feedback, would be a pretty reasonable sort of target, in my view.
I'm hearing an asymmetric loss function, Amit, that the downside is much greater for too quick rather than too long, but there's clearly downside on both fronts. And well done for you for tying in Lori Kutama's question about avoiding desk rejections. Do you want to add anything real quick, Mark, or Laura, to what Amit said about basically the issues of how to avoid a desk rejection for a paper that was submitted maybe too early, too prematurely?
Make clear what the contribution is, what part of it is new, and why the new piece relative to what other papers are doing is useful to somebody. That's it. You do that, you've avoided desk rejection.
Way to go. Way to go. All right, let's go to the next one. They're starting to come in. So is there an optimal length to a paper, Mark? Why don't you take that one?
I want to say 30 pages. That's what I would say, but certainly don't go much over 30. And usually if it's down around 20, at least for the papers I see, that's probably a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I don't mind a 20-page paper, you just don't see them. But what I don't like is when I flip ahead and see there's 45 pages, then hopefully you could see it more.
18 tables, 7 figures, and a 77-page internet appendix.
Exactly, yeah.
It's sort of suggests that this is a doctoral dissertation that's being converted. I understand some efficiency, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next one here. Some journals actually have options to identify potential referees that might have conflicts of interest because of, let's say, existing work that the scholar's paper, the submission might critique. How do you think about cover letters that actually include exclusions for referees? And maybe you can, if you wanted, let's go to Laura for this one. And maybe, do you want to give a little bit of insight behind the curtain on referee selection? You were talking about it earlier. It's sort of together. How do you
referee selection is probably one of the most important things that happens, maybe the most important thing that happens in the whole process. The reason you want an editor who's a good fit is because they'll choose the right kind of referees who will appreciate your paper. So it's enormously important. If somebody said, I really don't want this particular referee, like one, not these 10 people, not everybody in my area who hates me, but this one person, I think I generally respect that. Also it might signal to me that there's a big battle going on here, and that's interesting. Like I might, as I said before, I might take a really negative letter that was substantive, lots of ground for conflict, and say, hey, this is, anything that starts a discussion or a debate that's meaningful and substantive probably has something to it, and sparking that debate is useful. How I choose referees, it's a little different. If your paper is in my area and I really know this field, then I'm likely to go to people that I know off the top of my head do this kind of work. So you might want to think about, if your editor's in your area, are they going to send it their former students or their co-authors or, people whose work they've cited in the past, their network of people. Those are likely referees. If it's not in my sub area, I got to rely a little bit more on, this person and who they've cited and they've identified as their community, because I might not know. Or I might actually ask, that would be a good candidate for something where I'd ask an associate editor, could you recommend some referees for this one and tell me where this one should go. But referee selection is hugely important. The more you can predict that process and then adjust your paper accordingly. Think if this person were to write it, if the co-author or the editor were to get this paper because it's in their area, what would they think about it? What sort of objections would they have? What would make them think that this paper is valuable? That's a really helpful process.
Helpful for the submitter. Mark, referee exclusions and or the business of choosing referees as an editor.
Yeah, if somebody said they didn't want one person, I wouldn't send it to that person.
You would honor the request.
If there was several of them, I would view it as kind of suspicious as to, why they had such a big group of people they didn't think were going to be fair on the paper. And selection of referees, I agree, is important and it's tough. And I reach out to colleagues sometimes who know specific areas like analytical modeling more than I do and say, what do you think? Here's the general idea in a paper, because I do think it's important to get the right referee on it.
Yeah, good. Here's another one. So appeals. So should authors ever appeal a decision? I was tempted to say one of your decisions, but I mean decisions in general. If the answer is yes, then what are the circumstances? Amit, why don't you take that one? Appeals.
Yeah, so I think all the journals have a process around these things in a pretty structured manner. I think every journal strives to be transparent. So in the Journal of Finance, for example, there is an elaborate appeals process where you can, there's a cool off period where sometimes you might get, not too happy about a decision. So I think there's a cool off period, and then you're supposed to write a letter explaining why you disagree with the decision that was made and what the exact disagreement is. And, if all of us can make mistakes. We try not to, but we can. And the process in the Journal of Finance is a little bit more intricate in the sense that there is an associate editor, which takes a look at every paper. It's pretty much like management science, where there are referees and then an associate editor, and then you take a look as an editor. So the chances that a bunch of people have made mistakes are always small, but can happen. So the appeals case is all about, did we miss something? And if we did, there's a process where the papers go through the appeals process. And if it's clearly articulated what was missed by the referees, the associate editor or the editor, there have been instances where papers have proceeded subsequent in appeal, but they're rare. And they're rare for the reason that I just told you, that, if you have an associate editor and two referees and the editor taking a look at it, chances that they might have made a mistake are pretty low. So that's the reason that appeals, even though authors might appeal, the fact that there is a successful appeal, the instances of those things in good journals are very few. I mean, that's part of the governance of good journal, is how good are you doing not only on the impact, but also in treating papers which should be treated fairly. So that's how I think about the appeals process.
So a really good message then, Amit, for everybody out there is, if they're in this circumstance, you don't just go willy-nilly on the rejection. You've actually tried to pay attention to the journal's appeal policy and follow the appeal policy guidelines, right, Amit? And some journals actually publish the number of decisions that are overturned through the appeal process. I think we used to do that at the RFS, and I think they continue to do that. So guess what? Lots of questions are bubbling forward, and I can see your eyes are looking at some of these as well. But let me pick some. There's another follow-up question from Avisa Bogdani, actually, Laura, about you were talking, I think what prompted it was you were talking about this network of scholars that a journal editor might rely on to guide them. And the question is specifically, when would you ever decide to assign a paper as a reviewer to a PhD student or new assistant professor? And they may be making an association here with what you said, and I'm sure you probably want to clarify that.
Yeah, so I rarely assign a paper to a PhD student unless I knew the PhD student, they were near the end, I knew they had expertise in this area, and I were kind of supervising. Like I look a little bit more and make sure that this is a carefully done review. Assistant professors are a very common source of referee reports. In fact, it's unusual to get a paper from someone who's pretty junior and then assign it to a senior faculty member. I don't want to burn those folks out. They often will turn down reports. I might ask them as a referee with the idea that they'll probably turn it down, but they might tell me 5 other people who are more junior who are likely to do it. So I do think there's a little bit of seniority matching. I'm more inclined to ask a senior person for a paper of a senior person's paper simply because I'm a little worried if I ask a junior person to make judgment on somebody who's senior, that's a little intimidating. And they might be worried that this person's going to know who they are and they have lots of power over them. And so power dynamics make that tricky. So in general, there's a bit, not perfect, but there's a bit of seniority matching in the review process. But that does make it hard as an assistant professor because assistant professors are notoriously tough in their reviews, and we tend to mellow out a little as we get older and, be willing to find the diamond in the rough and work to support people. And so, it is hard starting out because you are getting people who are not as experienced in writing reviews when you first start out. You're writing papers that are harder to review because they're often less clear, and you're getting the people who don't have as much experience writing reviews. So the possibility for error early on is really high, but then you gotta, improve your paper, think about how to communicate a little bit more and, try again.
Great, terrific. Okay, so Fernanda has a question about feedback on a rejection, but I'm going to broaden it. Imagine you just received a rejection, and the question is, okay, what do you do now? What do you do? What do you do? Do you drop everything and do something, whatever that is? And I'm going to ask you, let's see, Mark, you take the first crack at this. How would your answer differ if it was an R&R you just got, literally dropped in the email just now, you got the R&R invitation, what do you do next? So answer the rejection one first and then answer the R&R one next.
I mean, a lot of it
Young
is
scholar, you think young scholar, important paper for them.
And unfortunately, your time has priorities, right? So you can't, it's easy to say you should jump in immediately and do it. But subject to that, you don't want to sit on it. You want to get to it as soon as you can. I think if it's a rejection, it's really important to take to heart what was said and try to fix it. I get too many cases where I go out to a reviewer and they say, I just rejected this paper, 4 days ago at another journal and it's identical, right? And to me, that's a super negative sign, I would say. But yeah, with an R&R,
the paper too quickly. They flipped the paper too quickly. It didn't distill the feedback. Yeah.
And the referee will say, I spent a lot of time on that damn referee report, right? And the fact that they just blew it off is really annoying to me. And it's annoying to me too as an editor. Yeah, and then with an R&R, like I say, you want to jump right in there as you have time and get that thing back in the queue again. And
what about feedback? Drawing in feedback from your colleagues, your senior colleagues?
Yeah, I would go to senior colleagues if I didn't know how to address a concern. Absolutely, yeah.
Amit, you want to add?
Yeah, I think, especially as a PhD student, and, you're seeing increasingly PhD students submit papers during their PhD time because everybody's trying to have publications by the time they graduate, or as assistant professors. I think this idea that how do you address comments if it's a revise and resubmit, because the referees are used to seeing how their comments have been responded to, and if you don't have that experience, you could address it in a way which is very different from the norm. So it's always a good idea to talk to your senior colleagues. They don't have to be very senior, just a few years ahead of you because they've been in the game, so they understand how do you write these referee responses. You have to be respectful. Even if you disagree, there are ways in which you write that doesn't seem to antagonize the referee. All the referee is hoping for is that you took their serious comments seriously. And if you address them, where was it addressed and how? And if you didn't address them, that you thought about them. And if you didn't, here is the reason. And hopefully the referee will agree that this is something that, okay, yeah, this seems reasonable. What you don't want to do is to sort of write a response where you say, yeah, looked at it, I don't think it's relevant. That doesn't necessarily fly. And this point that Mark was saying is something that happens a lot of times where authors get rejections. They think that there is no feedback really that they can incorporate. It's idiosyncratic, so just move on. And what ends up happening, like Mark said, is that if you have editors in journals, that should tell you something, that they are going to be going after similar referee pool, because if your paper is in corporate governance, you know who are the scholars who have worked in this area, who might be reasonable referees, and the chance that you draw similar referees in an area is pretty high. And so if not for anything else, just taking that into account, that you don't want to sample the same person and then that person looks at the paper and says, oh, nothing has changed, and they're pretty bummed about it. Now, you don't need to incorporate everything they say, because again, in a negative report, there'll be a lot of things that you might disagree with, but you may still want to address in some ways in the paper why you did not address something, because again, in your mind, you are clear that you have not addressed something because you think it's not relevant. So you want to have that in the paper, because hopefully when the reviewers see it, or if other audience sees it and have similar concerns, they can say, oh yeah, okay, I thought that you could extend it in this way, but yeah, okay, fine, this seems reasonable. You give it your best. So I think negative feedback is painful for everyone, but you don't want to not incorporate that.
Yeah, it's as painful as it is. You want to try and give it the best interpretation possible towards maybe improving your paper. I like that. I like that. That's great. Good message. So lots to choose from here. This one, I'm sorry, I was gonna go to Laura, but I'm gonna direct this to Mark, because it's from Leo, and he's talking about psych theory and experimental methods. And I think he's asking about how behavioral research is more and more informing policy. So it's reflecting back on that discussion. And he just wants to understand from the panel of expert editors here whether behavioral work is really genuinely welcome, and in which kind and in which journals. And there's an implication in the question if you read it. So do you want to take that, Mark? Because you actually, I think, referenced behavioral work that probably set Leo's question off as something that you're welcoming at JAE. And people are, I guess, wondering about that.
Yeah, it has a history, I think. So my advisor, will remain nameless, she had a big part of that sort of history at a different journal. But I think things have moved to where things that are more psychological and more behavioral are more commonly being seen. I think a lot of it is kind of field studies, where you're having some kind of an intervention and seeing how things play out. And I think that's very welcome. I know I get papers that are more behavioral as an editor, and I send them to behavioral reviewers. And to the extent that they don't make it through the process, it's very much because a fellow behavioral reviewer didn't think that it would be sort of meet the bar for the journal. So I don't think there's any, there's no discrimination, I think, against those kind of papers.
But it also implies that that maybe there are some subdisciplines within a broader field that may be tougher on each other than others. You hear these sort of stories, Laura, about theorists really just like to beat each other up in the refereeing process. You've heard those sort of things, and I'm sure that I'm trying to read the words in between the words of this question and try and draw you guys into saying something about this.
Okay, so I mean, I think for a while, behavioral economics and behavioral finance had a reputation as a very collusive field, right? Where people would easily accept each other's papers, and that got a lot of publications early on, and it got people tenure, and that was helpful for advancing the field. I actually, maybe more subfields should behave like that and try to help pull each other up. I'm not sure I see that as a bug, but maybe more as a criticism of other fields where, they were just tearing each other apart, and, seeing this as a zero-sum game. And I think most subfields are not a zero-sum game, that we want to see a thriving area, especially if it's a new area. When is something influential? Well, if lots of people are referencing it and using it, but that means that there have to be other people participating in this field and writing in this field. So you kind of benefit when they do well. Now, if their paper is super close to yours, yeah, sometimes there's a reason to, but yeah, that's really very rare. And usually people can do a good job of distinguishing what they're doing. And the novel, generally, I think more fields ought to behave like behavioral economics. Maybe not surprisingly, the behavioral economists, behavioral finance people got the behavior right. And we should maybe behave more accordingly. I guess maybe theorists are sometimes critical of behavioral work if it feels like the distance between the assumptions and the results isn't large, right? So I think to the extent that behavioral work systematically raises some suspicion, it's because somebody said, well, I just assumed that they did this, and I'm going to call that a behavioral assumption. And now look, I get some result that's really close to my assumptions. But really, any theory where the assumptions and the results are close to each other doesn't have a ton of content to it. It's kind of one of the metrics that decides the contribution. So yeah, I guess that's how I think about it.
Good, good. Okay, this one's for Amit. I'm going over to the Q&As, and there's a question from Pinar Genscher, and so this is for you, Amit. So is writing a causal paper the ultimate goal to be published? As an editor, what do you think about association and/or descriptive papers?
So I think, if you look at the causality revolution that happened in economics and then trickled down into finance and accounting, there was a period of time when there was a huge emphasis on getting the identification right. And then, so tons of papers, if you were testing the same phenomena that we understand what the trade-offs are, theoretically at least, and all you're doing is trying to now add more color to a descriptive study in the past and arguing that the effects are this way or that way. There was a huge explosion of that kind of work in all the finance journals and accounting journals too. I think what's happened is we have dialed back a little bit on that because you realize that identification, while it has its merits, has its limitations too. External validity and how good the instruments are and how good the design is. Natural experiments don't grow on trees, and RCTs can't be run in large organizations. And we are looking at corporate finance where we are thinking about big firms and so on. And there is now an appreciation of looking at descriptive work too, similar to how the field was a few years back, I would say. But at the same time, I think people don't not expect you to think and discuss in a pretty sensible manner what the concerns are and why you think that your descriptive statistics are still informative. And there are papers getting published. I can tell you in Journal of Finance for sure, where we have published descriptive studies in the last few years. Similar in RFS, when you go out and say climate finance, and let's try and understand what climate finance is and how does it affect our thinking in asset pricing about discount rates, cash flows, or corporate finance. You're not looking for a natural experiment immediately. If you get it, great, but if you don't, that's fine. Or if you look at fintech, again, an area where we are trying to understand what the implications are. Causality is not necessary there. You're still trying to understand what the economic mechanisms are. And as long as you can explain those in a reasonable manner, if it's a theory, even better. If it's not a theory, then at least you understand that there could be other things that are driving whatever you're showing. These papers can get published and do get published. And so it's like every editor is trying to balance the newness of the topic with your descriptive stats not being causally identified. At least that's the way I think about it. If it's a mature area, if you are going to be talking about corporate governance and what does voting do to some outcome, there are hundreds of papers out there. So if a paper gets published, it's probably a causally identified paper, which is either overturning what we knew or sharpening it in a way that we didn't appreciate. And that's totally fair game. But if it's a new topic, you're more likely to get leeway from the editor on it being descriptive statistics, of course, with you at least making it economically tight in how you explain things and being aware that there are threats which might lead to interpretation being a bit different than what your preferred interpretation might be. So I think that is something that is how I think about this.
Yeah, I like the way you balanced it out in terms of the maturity of the subfield and how far it's come along towards how open we are to a big descriptive. Now, Pinar actually had a follow-up, said he'd really like Mark Lang's quick take on that very question as well. Mark, from an accounting perspective, I think is what he's asking for.
I agree entirely with what was said. I mean, I think descriptive stuff is welcome. The most common reason I think I reject a paper is because it's what's referred to as a matrix paper. So I think I stole that from Lutzi Hale, but on one axis you have exogenous shocks, and on the other axis you have independent or dependent variables. And then you say, well, no one's ever matched this dependent variable with this exogenous shock. And it's like a black box where just because you have a plausibly exogenous shock, you're arguing that that sort of makes it interesting. And I think those kinds of papers are easy to reject because they don't provide any sort of granularity or descriptive. I'd rather have something that was more poorly identified, but it was clear what the mechanism was that was in play and exactly how this thing was working, than something that was simply identification for the sake of identification.
Good. The questions
I
are
want to add one thing to this.
Go ahead, Laura. Yeah.
So, I mean, a research agenda begins with facts, right? There's some things we want to explain. And then we have explanations that are theories. And sometimes those theories are kind of, a verbal explanation in a mostly empirical paper, but sometimes they take the form of formal models. And then an agenda has, again, data at the other end to distinguish between competing theories for the same facts, right? That's sort of a whole research program. And more, we're expecting people to do all of that in a paper. And I think that's nuts. I think it's perfectly fine to have a set of facts that will lead to the development of a number of theories, right? Again, it's who will use your paper and for what purpose. If you say these facts would lead us to think about theories that might do this or might do this or this, or to just write theories, right? And then say, here are some testable implications. Now the users are, the empirical researchers. Or to take existing theories and say, I'm going to run a test that would distinguish between theory A and theory A and theory B for the same set of phenomena. They've got different. So maybe this is a message to referees, but I think a paper should be able to do one of those things well and get published, even in the very best journals. But more and more, it's kind of easy for referees to say, well, you had some facts. Why don't you also tack on a theory? Well, you had a theory. Why don't you also tack on some data that distinguishes from this between other theories, and try to merge these different parts of the research process. But I think different people have different comparative advantages, and it makes enormous sense for a field to say, you can write a paper doing one of these things, understanding that there are other people who will contribute to the overall research endeavor. Fantastic.
Not every paper needs to be a smorgasbord. It can be a self-contained meal that is satisfying. I like it. Wonderful, wonderful. As you guys can see, we're coming to the end, and I feel horrible that we all knew this was going to happen. We even anticipated this, that the questions would just start flowing like crazy. But I think we need to end the session, and I want to thank just each of you, 3 excellent panelists, Laura Veldkamp, Amit Seru, and Mark Lang, just fantastic. I'd like to, on our behalf, the 4 of our behalves, make sure that we thank Megan Smith, who actually runs the Salem Center. She's behind the operation and making us all look good on these Zoom sessions. And special shout out to Scott Bogus, who's just doing a fantastic job leading the center. And really all of you for listening. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day. Lots of good sessions to come today, and all the best to you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.